and welcome to The Conversation. I am your host, Carla Barnett. Research and studies by the UN agencies and others have concluded that gender-based violence targets or affects women and girls disproportionately. The UNODC reports that about 1 in 3 women worldwide have experienced sexual and other forms of violence. Women are also much more likely than men to be killed by their intimate partners or family members. In a recent blog posted by the World Bank titled, "Casting Light onto the Shadow Pandemic in the Caribbean, Violence Against Women," the article reiterated that globally, 1 in 3 women have suffered physical and/or sexual violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And it went on to report that the 2020 statistics for the Caribbean found that nearly half of Caribbean women surveyed in 5 Caribbean countries face at least one form of violence, physical, sexual, economic, or emotional, by an intimate partner over their lifetime. The results show that violence against women is endemic. 46% of women in the 5 countries have experienced at least one form of violence. Our 2 guests this evening have decades of experience in human development and community work. Michelle Irving has been a community worker and advocate for over 25 years. Michelle is a founder and coordinator of the Productive Organization for Women in Action, POWER, a community-based organization in Dangriga which provides advice and support for victims of gender-based violence and HIV/AIDS. One of the objectives of POWER is to eliminate violence against women and girls. Under Michelle's leadership, the group has grown into a very vibrant peer-to-peer education women's group, reaching far into communities and working to transform the lives of women and their families. Michelle describes herself as a fearless feminist fighter for freedom. Welcome to The Conversation, Michelle. It is so good to have you here. How are you?
I am doing well, Dr. Barnett. Thanks very much for that warm introduction. And I am indeed happy to be here and to be talking about this topic in the context of, our communities
Right.
and here in Belize.
Thank you so much for being here. Our other guest is Arthur Usher, who has more than 25 years of experience in youth and human development, serving in various roles. He has worked with the National AIDS Commission, served as program officer at the YMCA and at the Belize Central Prison, a youth officer at BFLA, executive director of the Global Parish Project, and much, much more. He's a member of the Engaging Men and Boys Initiative and CARIMAN, the Caribbean Male Action Network. Arthur has a bachelor's degree in social work from the University of Belize. Welcome to the show, Arthur.
Hi, well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us. This is a very important topic, so let us jump right in. Arthur, do you know if we have statistics in Belize on gender-based violence? Are there any studies or surveys that are done on a regular basis?
Well, I wouldn't say as regularly as we need, but we do have the Belize Crime Observatory and some other departments, women departments in these areas where we can get our data from. So I think we have enough data to really put together a scope or an idea as to what the situation is in Belize.
Okay, and so we're beginning to collect that data.
Right.
More than we used to in the past. Michelle, assuming that the Caribbean statistics apply to Belize, this would mean that almost 50% of women and girls face some form of gender-based violence in their lifetime. What are the main reasons for gender-based violence in Belize? What does your work show?
I believe, to my mind, that Belize would be no different from the other Caribbean countries, as you spoke to a while ago. And so I would tend to agree that we would be looking at that, especially if we're looking at violence throughout the life cycle. Because when you're talking about girls, for example, you have sexual abuse. A lot of it is unreported or underreported.
Right.
We also have physical violence, neglect, psychological and emotional abuse. Starting off as from being a girl, from being a child, and a girl child especially. And so we see the issue throughout the Caribbean, I think, and Belize is no exception, of a cultural base in violence, a culture that is based in violence. We tend to support most of our action through being violent, and after a while, it has become the norm. And I think that in our
It's sort of
family,
acceptable.
it is very much so. And I think that we have to talk about violence in total, probably, in looking at how we socialize our children, though differently for boys and for girls, but nonetheless, I think violence is ever present in their lives,
Right.
from being, from childhood, from
From
early on.
childhood through to adulthood. So
Yes.
adults do what they learn as children,
Exactly,
sort of thing.
exactly. So
Right.
I think those are some of the issues, and I think that we also have to look at the broader issue of how we relate, how we organize our societies, and how we accept unequal power relations, and how that is fostered, and how
Right.
is continued in terms of gender socialization, and someone believing that they have power and control over the other person.
Right.
Even, throughout, again, if you see it manifested as, maybe I'm bigger, I'm stronger, I have more money than you.
That sort of thing. Right.
Yes. So there is that constant struggle in terms of not accepting equity and equality, and supporting others who need to be supported, and not respecting people as in mutual
As
relationships,
equals. Right.
as equal, as
Right.
adults,
Right.
especially when we become adults as well. So we see the
Right.
same patterns of socialization, that the one who feels or think that they have the power and control, then find it acceptable,
Right.
sometimes even culturally acceptable, that then violence could be used to what they deem to correct behavior. I know you talked about data, and I know that the mixed survey, for example, was collecting some information, by asking people, when do you feel it's appropriate for a husband to hit a wife? And there were both some wife and some husbands who agree that, if
That
she
there
does
were times when that would be acceptable.
that is appropriate
Right.
behavior.
Right.
And so that's to show you how very much ingrained it is
In our society.
culture.
Arthur, when we think about domestic violence, we most often refer to the physical abuse, but there are other forms of this, mental, psychological, and emotional, that we also need to take into account, huh?
Right. And so this is, I guess, tantamount to what Michelle was speaking, which is, we look at the dominance in terms of the physical side, which is why for most times we see men being the perpetrators. I would have to, I'll be remiss to not mention that psychological part, as, there are cases of women physically abusing men, but for the most part, a lot of the domestic violence or abuse that happens to men is psychological.
Right.
And sometimes it cannot be physically seen, therefore it cannot be physically reported. And so we end up with a situation of he said, she said. And so,
Right.
And because of the, again, like what Michelle said, there are societal stigmas against what constitutes masculinity and what constitutes a man. And so when a man goes to report something like this, he is usually met with disdain, or you're not a man, or you got a woman to beat you, this kind of thing.
Right.
So we also have to factor in the psychological part of the abuse, and that goes for both men and women, as we speak about the psychology and all of these other areas.
Right. Right. Let's take a look at the unequal powers between men and women in relations as a fuel for domestic violence. Traditionally, in our society, men have been the main breadwinners, and many men do use that to wield power over their female partner. Michelle, you spoke a little bit about this earlier. Can you help to explain this imbalance and why it is used as a basis for abuse? One of the things that that bother me sometimes is that within the household, the woman's role, caring for the family and sometimes the whole community, that is unpaid work. It is valuable work, but it is unpaid. And because it is unpaid, it is undervalued, and this factors into the unequal relationship that we see. How do you see all that?
For sure. Our societies, we tend to say, we use a gender term as a patriarchal society where wealth, value, money, those things are, used to be handed down to the male in the society.
Right.
He was the one who controlled the family wealth. And so women work was relegated to what we call unpaid labor, and then therefore undervalued. Because if you're not getting paid for something, it cannot be valuable, even
Right.
though we know that it may be the most valuable work that you could ever do. And any society has to depend on that work. There was one
Right.
study that says that women contribute $1 trillion every year to the global economy through their unpaid labor. And so we see, that's in itself as a form of exploitation. So you have the exploitation. When we talk about power and control, we see the exploitation structurally that is accepted by the state, that women, who stay at home don't get paid. We see some societies try to give some value to that work and try to recognize that work in their GDP and things like that. But, in the Caribbean, we're not there as yet.
No, we have not begun to talk about doing that.
Yes. So we see then, if you have wealth, as you're aware, we call these intersections. If you have wealth, if you have power, and therefore you can basically do what you want and then to control someone else. And so that is no different in the society, and the same thing at home. However, now we see, even if we might see men maybe that is maybe not rich, not making a lot of money, but sometimes they wield more control over the money that they make to kind of shore up their status, their status in the society.
Right.
So you have this dichotomy where this equates with power, and if you have power, then people have to do what you say.
Right.
And
Right.
the woman and the children don't have the power, then they have to obey. And if they don't obey, you use corrective measures, which is sometimes physical violence. But Arthur also spoke to something as we conversation a while ago, psychological violence and emotional violence. And that is very, very common. Even it's usually accompanied with physical or sexual violence. So that's where that unequal, what we call unequal power relationship, that's when we talk about that
Right.
the society give one gender more value in terms of what they do. So they're able to go out there, they're able to earn income for the family, they're able to get a lot, they're able to build a house, for example, secure the family basic needs. So they're the most valuable person in the society. And so then you think that, well, you have license to then to be able to do what you will. Because then I feel that a lot of times, for example, in relationships, you see that person, because they think they're in control, uses violence, but they wouldn't react the same way if they were on the street, maybe with a regular, a pair.
Right,
because
right.
then they are not seeking to control that pair. You know,
Right,
that pair,
right.
that
But
person,
this is something that happens at home.
right?
Yes, in within the family relationship.
Because of the need to
But one of the
control.
things that we're seeing though, and that we have to be aware of, and Arthur, you might want to talk about this a little. While it is usually the case that the male has greater economic power because they earn the larger income in today's world, many women are earning incomes of their own. Many go out to work, many have little businesses. Sometimes they earn more than their male partners, and still these women can be subjected to domestic violence. So it is not only a matter of the economic power. And this may be happening, and we may see quite accomplished women, successful and confident women, but at home it's a different story. So what explains that? Because it's not purely economic power, clearly.
Yeah, I often get that question, and a lot of people are looking for a black and white answer on that one. I really cannot give a black and white answer for that. For me, it's more case by case at that point, because some of our data doesn't apply, right? So we're saying, you know, if the man is making all the money and he's doing all of this and he's the one controlling house, then it might be domestic violence. But as you're saying, if the woman now is making all this money and running the house financially, what then leads to domestic violence from the man? Is it that he's insecure and that he can no longer, he doesn't want to, he needs to beat down physically on the woman in order to maintain
Right.
machismo or whatever? Or is it that the family unit subscribes to different either societal or religious or whatever belief systems, and therefore the man will be the head of the household? Does that mean that he then has the authority to subdue in terms of the negative connotation of submission?
Right.
So we have to look at multiple things that affect the home at that point. I would not venture to say that there's a specific point that is yes, if these factors are met, then yes, domestic violence is met.
Right.
It will be a more case by case situation when it comes to that. Most of our studies tend to be around what we have touched on so far, which is economic factors and some social factors and stuff like that. And so the studies can pick up on that. But really, I would like to see, I guess, a more defined study as to some of these other areas that also affect domestic violence in whatever way.
Right, because clearly it's not purely the economic factor. There are other things at play. And one of the things that we talk about sometimes is the way it is cyclical, it's generational. So either the perpetrator or the victim or both would have been exposed to it in their own homes as children. And so it's replicating itself in our society and in our families, right? Right, right, right. Michelle, why are red flags normally ignored or forgiven? You know, first, you know, it might be a little yelling and then being, you know, hurtful and demeaning things, and then it grows to, you know, a slap now and again, and then it gets, you know, to this place where you end up at the police station. And what are some of the red flags, and what advice do you have for women, do you give to women before it gets that way?
Well, when you ask that, my mind went immediately to Maya Angelou, and you know, we all know her.
Yes.
And she's wife, and I think she was married like 8 times. And she said, as soon as they start to pick one pick, she leave, because if you don't, they will pick and pick and pick at you until you die, like ducks. And I mean, that might sound dramatic or extreme, because we're like, oh, well, like human beings, you know, but I think what she's saying is, as soon as you know the intent of that person is to undermine you, to undervalue you, to make you feel less than who you are, I think the red flag should go up right there and then. But many times we're so socialized, to stay in relationships till death do us part, to have that one union, and to be with this
Right.
one person. And so we are often criticized if we leave from partner to partner to partner, especially as women, as we know in our society.
Right.
If you have children from multiple partners, or you have rainbow picnic, or you have multiple baby daddies.
Right.
So all of these things are socializing tools, you see? And so people would think, oh, well, you don't really mean it, it just may have a bad day. So you would
Right.
justify a
You
way,
excuse it.
you excuse it, and you
Right.
find, you say, oh, and then even the perpetrator, sure enough, the next day, the person will realize, I can cook, oh, babes, I may cook for you, or I may pick your
Right.
clothes, or do something that you feel will, say, you never really mean it. You never really mean for tell me those hurtful things.
Right.
And so we have to remember that domestic violence happens in the context of where people are in a love relationship.
Right.
It's not this is not a stranger on the street. If your neighbor may tell you the same thing, you stand up and you cuss out and you not talk to her for 10 years. However, this is a person who courted you, told you how much they really appreciate, they love you, they fall in love, and you have all this psychological, emotional
Right.
thing that happens. And so when these kinds of characteristics or different issues start to happen, we don't pay attention to it. And even sometimes when you reach to it's right in front of your face, you still say, well, it really never meant for hit me that hard. He may just drunk, or he may upset with the boss. And so we continue to
We make
do
the
that.
excuses.
We continue to make the
We make the
excuses. So
excuses. Right.
it's I feel that it is a process. And you talk about advice. I think that what I would tell, and I would like to say that I have worked with both men and women, and it's no easier for anyone who is going through a situation of violence. I mean, men cry just as much as women do
Right.
when they're in these very difficult situations, and they do some of the very same things. They try to make up, they try to behave the way they were told that they need to behave, not to cause anger or
Right.
outbursts. And so, but I think that it is a process, and sometimes I believe that the issue of being empowered, of knowing who you are, of strong self-esteem or developed self-esteem, high self-esteem, I feel
Right.
that those are the things that will get you through, because we have to remember it's not you can't go and tell somebody get left me because he not good for you, or boy
That doesn't work. That never
that does
works. That's not
not
how it goes.
work. That
Right.
does not work. So
Right.
the advice here would be that, well, to discuss with the person, if you have a friend or so, and say, it tell me this and it really hurt me, and I really feel bad. And so you find out, well, why you think that they triggered those feelings in you, and try to talk to the person about them, because a lot of
Right.
times a lot of the attention is paid on the abuse. Like, why he do that for? If he may come do me, you know what I may do? I may just,
Right.
and that kind of
Exactly.
way. And then that is the attention now is paid to the negative behavior, and not the way how the person was made to
Response.
feel.
Right.
Right?
Right.
I think those are
Right.
some of the switch that those of us in working with people, with communities, or even supporting our friend, right?
Right.
Need to say, and you focus on your friend, on that person who feels violated, who feels victimized.
Without judgment. I always tell people as well, without judgment. Don't make
Yes.
judgments, because the
So
judgment
that's it.
factor That stops the
That's one of the
conversation
worst
right
things.
there,
And
right?
then, you know, and
Right.
sometimes people leave, and I would like to say that, you know, I would tell them, even in my 9 to 5, my regular work, I would say, no matter how many times you
Right.
leave and you need the service, you're to come back, because we're here to
As
serve
many
you.
times as necessary.
But
Right.
people put a judgment on themselves, or others judge them, and they say, "Girl, you not left here yet." And oh, we are
I
wait for me to
know,
kill
I
you. You're
know.
to get flowers, and so those things they don't help, because we
That
have
that's never a helpful approach.
that's
That's
never, and we
yeah,
have to always
yeah, yeah.
remember, even if somebody is trying to leave an abusive relationship, it takes an average of 8 to 10 times of actively trying to leave
To leave before they
before
actually
that
do.
person could leave. That's a
Right,
study done in the Caribbean. So that is
right,
our reality. You see what I am saying? And it's no
right,
different. Sometimes somebody might make it out in one time or 2 times, but some people might take 12 times, 15 times before they can make it out. And we have to always remember, in the issue of violence, because of ownership, because of power and control, trying to leave is the most dangerous time.
it is the most dangerous time indeed. Yes, that's what the studies show. Arthur, I would guess that most of us know of a close family member or a friend who is in an abusive relationship. Many of us do know about that. Why are we generally silent about domestic violence? We know it happens, but for many of us, we ignore it unless it's right in your face. Is it just convenient for us to say that it is best to mind our own business? Why do we not want to talk about it?
Yeah, it's convenient and it's cultural, right? So it's that Caribbean mentality for the most part that mind your own business, not really really happening at this house kind of thing. So we do have that culturally. So in terms of where we are with that, it's just our acceptance that it does not directly concern us. So why should we get involved?
Right,
That also goes back to like what Michelle said. We are in usually people in these situations are in a love relationship, and so if I stick my neck out or say and maybe call police or make a report, and the abused drops the charges and goes back to the abuser, and we're neighbors, and they know that me make the report, you know,
right,
I would be blackballed, right? And cast
right,
aside, and always to stick in my business. So, like you said before, it's cyclical in terms of how the society feeds on it and feeds on ourselves. And so where
right,
you really have to step out of your comfort zone and say, look, I will be responsible and make a report.
right,
Whether or not you ban me from the community or whatever it is you think you want to do, I'll do it for your best interest. And so it takes a strong person to do that because nobody wants to be ostracized. Uh,
right.
but again, our society breeds this concept, and it, it it was, I think it was designed to protect, but I'm not sure who is protecting.
Exactly, exactly. Viewers, we will take a short break and be right back to continue our discussion on domestic violence. Good night and welcome back to the conversation. I am your host, Carla Barnett. In this segment, let us try to get a little bit better understanding from the male perspective on this issue of gender-based or domestic violence. The fact is that although there are situations of men being victims of domestic violence, a majority of the perpetrators are men. Data in the US, for example, shows that as much as 80% of domestic violence victims are women. Why is it that most men don't call out their friends when they know or witness these abuses? Why is that so, Arthur?
Um, Well, like I said, I will not speak for all men, but there is the cultural, I guess, mind your own business, which is a bit of bro code. Um, so, in terms of who we are and what we do within our own home and how a man runs his particular home, um, it's basically up to him and his family. I would not say that men do not um, call out each other. There are a lot of conversations around the feach table or play basketball afterwards, or a lot of socialization that happens that men do speak on it to other men. Um, and they might say that, yo, that's not right, whatever, whatever, whatever. So there is that conversation. I think more often than not, we do have that conversation. Um, Whether or not it's in a bigger sphere might be the question. It's more within our small groups and our close friends. If we know something and we're like, look, man, don't do that, whatever, whatever. It's more at that level, I would say, rather than to say, oh, well, take a foot forward and say, look, this is the overall stance.
Right.
And so in saying that, why is it that men don't do it? I would not say that we don't do it. I would say that it's done more at our level.
At their level. I know of a particular situation where one man said to another one, why are you doing that? You should not be doing that. And the response was that, why are you telling me this?
Right.
Because, we're a man together kind of thing, and we are supposed to be allowing as men for that behavior to take place. And so oftentimes we hear of stories like that where an abuser expects his friends to accept the behavior that he shows, because that can be become a difficulty within the friendship if
Right.
one friend tells the abuser, you should not be doing that, and so
It's happening
it can be
more
difficult.
often than not. I think that, as you said, it's usually with the closer friendships. And so if I feel comfortable enough to say something about that, I would.
Okay.
And then again, yes, there might be some temporary issue with the relationship, but
Right.
if you're friends long enough, then they will oversee. And the other part to that, or the extension to that, would be if the person is maybe a repeat offender.
Right.
What social structures are there to support a man who does that without judgment? And
Right.
that's where we're ending up with the issue, right? So if the friend calls him out and he says, okay, well, okay, I admit that I did something wrong. Where do I get help?
Right. Is age a factor? An older man with a young woman, for example, is that a factor in it? Sometimes men do find themselves in situations with quite young women, and that is the mechanism to control, sort of, and they know that it's a sort of toxic relationship, but they stay in it because having a nice young wife works and for them, and then there's the other side of it, because oftentimes you hear of situations where the women may stay for financial considerations as well. So the factors that play in this are really quite complex. No, it's not that so easy to understand.
Right. And that's why I said from the beginning that I would not try to do a blanket statement. Because yes, you might have an older man, younger woman, you might have an older woman, younger man, and the situation might be quite reversed. So abuse can happen in any situation, as Michelle spoke about earlier, in terms of power dynamics and power balances. I think those are the key factors. However, that power is displayed or
Right.
or used, um, dependent on the relationship, right? So
Right.
you would find varying degrees of these power plays happening, and so to say a dry, cold, this is a cookie cutter kind of thing, I would not say that.
Right.
But I would say that in terms of power dynamics, that's the main cause or continuous thread throughout all of them.
Right, and there may be instances, there may be situations where if the children become part of this power dynamic too,
Right.
and you find that particularly where women may use the children to exert some sort of power in the relationship, and that is also not acceptable, no?
Right.
Yeah, Michelle, what happens when women use the children as part of a domestic violent kind of approach to treating with the male, with the man?
Before I maybe I just want to for us to remember some of the historical factors that plays here, So even though we're saying, culturally, and this is the way, and Anata spoke well about how men would behave and stuff, but we have to remember that you had the rule of thumb, where a man was, he could have legally beaten his wife with a stick no more than the size of his thumb.
Right.
So we have to remember that, marriage connotate ownership. So, up until, I think my mom would give me stories of back in the day when even the woman would try to run away, run to someone else, that person was obligated to give her back to her husband because,
Right.
almost like property. So we have to, and if we're talking, it's just a generation remove, So we are quite new in addressing this issue. So we know that any kind of social change, sometimes we have the law moving ahead of the socializing agents, in the society. So I think that kind of helped for us to explain why we don't maybe have collective men saying that, hey, that's not acceptable. I wouldn't want that for my daughter. I wouldn't want that for my mother, for my aunt, for my grandmother. So, you shouldn't do it, because that's not acceptable. How would you like if the shoes were on the other foot and that kind of thing? Right. So then we had where this was a private matter. Women couldn't carry these things to the court. They would be laughed at.
Right.
And so when now we come around now, and we see now some of the changes, for example, in Belize, and you were talking about, for example, children, right? And you're talking about maybe custodial rights. We see in unmarried couple that women are the custodians of the children. That's what the law gives them, the custody of the children. And so men would have to then apply to the court for visitation.
For visitation, right.
Right. And sometimes it's very, very difficult. It's very, these are some sticky points in violent relationships or in relationships that, could be verbally, psychological. Not when I say violent, I am talking about all the types of violence. I'm not only talking about
not only physical, but emotional, psychological, and financial as well. But let me ask you this, Michelle. Since we're saying that culture and traditional beliefs are sort of the foundation where a lot of this comes from, what are the messages we therefore giving the young people coming up? Because we're continuing to see it so clearly, even though the law may have changed, the practices have not changed. And so what are the messages?
I am telling you the messages, at least when I do sessions with young persons and young men, I'm saying 19, 20, 21, it's horrible. Because they actually believe that, their wife or their girlfriend is their property. For example, they don't need consent for sex. Trying to explain to them marital rape, that is like, no, that can't happen. Once it's like for you.
Right.
And so they have the same antiquated ideas that even though the law may have passed that and moved towards, because police have some progression in the law.
Right,
as
in
it
the law,
relates to
right.
issues.
So the law, as you say, has sort of gone ahead in some
Yes.
respects,
then
but
when we
the
start to have
society
a
hasn't caught
conversation,
up with the thinking.
Right. We talk
Right.
about consent. I mean, young men are like, consent? What's wrong with you, miss? And that kind of and those kinds of things.
So it's a constant education process. It's a constant discussion, a constant opening of the mind.
And then now you have here where you have some of the difficulties. You have where we have, even in my organization, the push is to empower women, to empower girls, to teach them their rights. So right there in the session when we had both men and young men and young women, the young women were like, "What's wrong with you, boy? These are my rights," and they begin to exert what they know to be their right.
Right.
I think that men are very challenged to see themselves going to, for example, family court, to see they always view themselves in those settings as
being somewhat disadvantaged.
Yes, as the bad guy, because they are, they're taken there to take their money, to take away, to break up their family, and so women now are using the law to get support and to move on, but men are very hesitant
to do the same.
Right, to do the same.
So there is a lot more of discussion and learning and teaching both men and women, boys and girls, as they're coming up, to think differently in order to break the cycle.
Correct. I agree.
Right.
I agree 100%.
Okay. So we will take a short break and return to continue the discussion and discuss what we as individuals and as a society can do about domestic violence. Welcome back to the conversation. In this final segment, let us focus on what we can do to reduce gender-based violence. It is clear that we need a whole of society approach to address this issue of violence against women and girls. What role should each of the following play, Michelle? Government, schools, media, families, individuals, the whole of society. What role should all these actors be playing?
Well, I would like to start with the state government. We know, and we always say that violence against women and girls is one of the #1 human rights violation in the world. And so we look at this issue from an issue of a violation of your right, because you have the right to live a life free
from violence, right?
And so we can't put it any clearer than that. So the state responsibility in any human rights situation is to protect its citizens. And where that there are vulnerability, or there are citizens who are, exposed to this type of violence, then the role and the duty of the state to ensure that they offer maximum protection. And usually that protection is done through the law. And so we know that in the police department, they develop the domestic violence unit. We have to go farther than that. We have to ensure that each and every officer is knowledgeable on how to respond to domestic violence. Maybe the unit could give additional support, but when we're talking about responding, and we need to then also come up with adequate mechanism to ensure that we are responding. We know sometimes women would say that we call the police, but the police say they don't have no mobile, they can't come. We can't. The state cannot have this as excuse. Too bad jump on a bicycle man and come out and say, how you could de-escalate the situation.
I know. So it's about the role of the state to protect
Right. So
and
it's about
enforce the
look at the
law.
state, and then
Right.
that is continue on with the courts, and the law, and to ensure that then the law is used to its maximum to ensure that we have good laws. But a lot of times the implementation is needs to be strengthened. Let's put it
Right.
like that. And
Right.
so we need to then continuous training and support for those in terms of the state. I
Right.
think that, and there's also the area of the women's department, the women's commission. Some of these other quasi institutions like National Committees for Families and Children, that are there to then look at some of the international treaties, look at some of the
Right.
standards that are there, and then ensure that we're moving up to that. We are strengthening our position at all times. And while we may not be
What about the other parts of society? What about
for
the
sure,
media?
I want to come to our communal responsibility. That's what I'll
Okay.
put it as. I feel that communally we all have a responsibility, and we are all growing in our knowledge, in the way how we want to treat both perpetrators and victims, because I feel that we can't leave perpetrators out of the conversation
No,
either.
you can't.
That we need to understand what is going on, because if we just continue to turn our way or shun the person or behave like the person didn't do anything, I don't think that is helping the situation any at all. And so I feel that we have to then make our shoulders broad enough to be able to deal with whatever is happening in our society, however difficult it is. So I feel that culturally, community has a huge role to play. So continued education in and out
Right.
of school. I want to say in and out of school. Informal education is also very valuable. Peer-to-peer
Right.
education is also very valuable. And we can't discredit anybody, because sometimes you could learn from the person who might have been one of the what we consider the worst perpetrator, but that person could turn their life around. While there's life, there's hope. And so for us to be supportive of especially victims, understanding what they're going through, walking in their shoes, and
Right.
ensuring that we don't have to have a lot to say, but we just have to always be there, be that rock for that person. And without, I will say this, without this judgment or this expecting anything from them in return, meaning that if I support you, you are left out. Or that might be what you might come home and rail up to your next friend, or rail up to the wall, that you're frustrated, because it is frustrating. But at the end of the day, I think that once you make a commitment for that support, I think that we need to ensure that we understand what the dynamics is, and so that you could easily say, oh, should they go through this phase? Oh, should they go through that phase?
Right.
Okay, this is where they
Right.
happen. And so that will strengthen us. So the media, these conversations are very, very, very important. We should
Right.
have much more of them, and they should be in all spheres. So we could talk about how domestic violence affect our GDP, how many work hours we lose, how
Michelle, you
many.
want us to do 2 or 3 more programs on this, right?
Just saying, I'm just saying we
I'm
could talk
hearing
about
you.
it from different angles. We
I
could talk about
know.
it
I
from different
know.
angles. So it's not just a private matter that
Well,
happens in the
I tell
home.
people sometimes that we lose many days of work because women
Yes,
stay home
yes, yes.
after they go through a
And
situation
we
of
lose the
violence, and so lots of work is lost.
hospitalization.
Lots of
Yes,
production is lost.
yes,
Yes.
we spend money in hospitalization, in medication,
Right.
in lack of time
Right.
to children. Children cannot succeed when they're supposed to
Right.
do their homework. They cannot, they were to get a scholarship, they to pass 5 CXC, they can't, because they're big fighting in the house. And so they can't
Right.
study, they can't focus. And so we lose a
So
bit.
we need
So
a whole of society approach. We
we
can't,
need
and
a
it will not
whole.
fix itself.
Yes, and we need
Right.
that to be in all of in everything that we do. We have to be thinking about how this issue would affect. If we're thinking about development of small business, how would domestic violence affect the development of small business?
Right.
the productive sector, agriculture, everything. It
Right,
impacts
right,
everything. And so it plays on our ability to be happy, productive, successful citizens. It also plays into the amount of violence we see on the street.
right.
And so we have to see it as a whole society issue. We have to. And
Right.
so
Thanks, Michelle. Let me ask Mr. Russia. Tell me, Arthur, if you know someone is being abused, what should you do? What should you do? And I know we talked about this before, but as we're closing off the show, what do we do? Are there services that you can recommend? Are there what can we do to help?
Right. So you have DBU units, the police. If it's caught in the act, whatever, your neighbor, you have these units. You have women's department. You have human services.
Right.
I mean, I would say, short of putting yourself in danger, I would say provide some form of support.
The support, the listen and support,
Whatever
and
right? So I
right,
would not say
right,
run over to your neighbor's house and put yourself in harm's way, but maybe the next day you can speak to the neighbor and say, look, make a carry-out, wine, there's
right,
support. I think the issue of we sometimes misconstrue friendship with support, and we're good with our neighbors, but we still to their business. We're not really,
right,
that kind of way. And so I think that we need to provide some level of support or conversation or a window for them to open up, right?
right,
So, and it starts from the small things, right? So we're speaking about your neighbor, your family, your aunt or good friend or somebody, and that small conversation might propel to seeking a service or some kind of referral or something.
right, and give encouragement, not judgment. That's what I always say. Give encouragement,
And so and
not
again,
judgment.
that goes across genders, and I would say the same for the men. We speak to, earlier we spoke about empowerment of women and all these women organizations, and one of the main things that I often look at is support for men, not just men who have been abused, but men who are abusers. How do we provide support for them?
So that they can learn different behaviors, different ways of
Because
coping with anger, for example.
exactly,
Right,
and how they can then help the next generation, because it's a cycle that cannot continue. We have to figure a way to break it. So
right,
how do we break that cycle, right? So I think one of the major things we have to do is empowerment on a broader scale, right? So it's not just empowerment of the victims, right? For years we've been focusing, and that's great. That's a lot of resources in empowerment for the main victims, women and girls, but there are a lot of boys who grew up and are now men who are now perpetrators.
right.
And if you had engaged a bit more with them 20 years ago, maybe they would not be perpetrators today.
Right.
So we have to
So when you're talking about empowering men, you're talking about allowing men to be able to get the help that they need to learn differently, to behave differently.
right.
Right.
Again, it's
Okay.
like what Michelle said, it's a community-based approach, and so men are part of the community as well.
Exactly.
Right? So we have to encompass everybody in order to make the change real.
Right. Thank you. Thank both of you for being here on the show this evening, Michelle and Arthur. It's been a very interesting conversation around that hugely difficult topic, and I'm sure that we're going to be having many more of these kinds of conversations in the future. We did not have enough time to go as deep as we would have wished, but we were able to have a multidimensional examination of this plague we suffer across the world, domestic violence. Domestic violence comes in many forms: physical, sexual, emotional, and economical. Normally, it starts with fleeting signs that become red flags, and then suddenly it's a 24/7 beast that terrorizes victims almost daily. These victims who are almost always women and girls. So how do we solve this generational curse that affects a lot of us, or at least one person that we know? Most of us know at least one person suffering. There is certainly not one solution. It requires all of society and all of us to respond, and from many different angles. We need to minimize the socioeconomic disparities that keep many women dependent and ultimately vulnerable to many forms of abuse. We need to divorce ourselves immediately from the illogical, patriarchal, and cultural mental prisons that stipulate such things as a woman's place is in the home, or she is to serve her man and stick by his side no matter what. That's the old way of thinking. We need to update laws and impose stiffer penalties for abusers and greater protection for victims from the second they report any abuse to the minute the abuser is penalized. We need to help young boys growing up to learn early that it is okay to feel all your emotions, but it is not okay to lash out in violent anger. And most importantly, accountability. We need to hold our family members accountable, our friends accountable, and even ourselves. Many of us walk around with rage, insatiable appetites for dominance, and uncontrollable emotions. Those are breathing grounds for violence, and that violence often unleashes itself in the home. It is we that must also seek the help that we need before we abuse. It's the right thing to do, and it is way overdue. With that, our time is up for tonight. Remember to join us on Mondays at 7 p.m. for new episodes of The Conversation right here on CBTV and on Colorblind's Facebook page. Good night.